Between 1788 and 1801, the Coldlake estate in Salem was the subject of growing suspicion. Known for its self-isolation and strict internal codes, the family lived under rules no one else in town could understand. Locals whispered about ceremonies, but nothing was proven. It wasn't until the winter of 1801 that town records quietly noted an incident described only as a duration anomaly in sacramental practice. No one officially investigated it. But one surviving document described a 48-hour baptism. No explanation was ever released. The Coldlake family operated the Willowgate Home, a small private infirmary on the southern edge of Salem. Licensed as a charitable institution, it was registered under the Massachusetts Board of Poor Relief as a voluntary faith-based medical home. The facility was promoted as a haven for orphaned infants and the spiritually neglected. Parish bulletins celebrated the family's strict religious devotion. In 1795, the local congregation even funded an expansion wing. Despite rumors of overlong rites and unnecessary fasting, the Coldlake name retained its sanctified status throughout New England's reformist circles. No formal allegations were ever upheld. In the late 18th century, institutional reputations were defined less by oversight and more by perception. For the Coldlake family, perception was a controlled substance. The Willowgate home stood behind a cedar barrier along the Old South Road, where the woods remained dense and the path was prone to frost as early as October. Few passed that way, unless by intention. To those inside Salem's administrative circle, however, Willowgate was not obscure. It was considered among the town's most rigorously devout establishments, consistently cited in reports from the Massachusetts Board of Poor Relief as a model for provincial spiritual care. The Coldlake patriarch, Elias Coldlake, submitted quarterly records in cursive so rigid and symmetrical that reviewers often praised the penmanship in the margins. These records detailed enrollment numbers, supply inventories, and religious observances. No disciplinary reports, no flagged practices. By statute, homes such as Willowgate were required to host annual parish inspections, during which a visiting cleric reviewed the living conditions and catechism routines. All such visits concluded with favorable marks. The Coldlakes ensured this through strict adherence to what they termed spiritual governance, a system that blended sacramental repetition with behavioral codes. These codes were never made public, but clergy who visited were shown excerpts, often framed in walnut and placed in the entry hall beside a basin of preserved salt water. Among the few outside the family granted routine access was Deacon Abram Shett, a semi-retired theological auditor assigned by the Salem vestry. His writings, archived later by a librarian in Danvers, describe Willowgate as exceptionally rigid but free of chaos. He noted an absence of informal sound, a phrase he did not clarify. His reports lacked criticism. Instead, he often remarked on the staff's punctuality and the cold precision with which they conducted daily rites. Most staff were drawn from among extended family members. The Coldlake line included 3 siblings of Elias, Marianne, Ruth, and Aldous. Each oversaw one of the infirmary's halls. Aldous, the youngest, had a documented background in accounting and managed procurement and logging. Marianne directed the nursery wing, which hosted up to a dozen children under the age of 4. Ruth, whose own child had died in infancy under unstated causes, was assigned the baptismal suite. The suite itself occupied a separate building connected to the main home by a passage of whitewashed stone. While most provincial infirmaries used simple basins or fonts, Willowgate maintained a full immersion chamber lined with slate and shaped like a cistern. The records show it was sourced from a dry well in 1789, reinforced with lead fittings and sealed with lime-based mortar. Water was drawn not from the Salem pump district, but directly from a forest spring through a copper siphon buried beneath the perimeter trees. According to an 1800 maintenance invoice, the system was inspected once a year by a pipewright from Wrentham. He marked all systems functional. No irregularities were reported. Religious practice in Willowgate was recorded through a ledger referred to in Coldlake documents as the observance log. This was not stored with other files, but kept in a locked shelf in Ruth's office. It catalogued the sequence and duration of every baptism conducted between 1790 and 1801. The entries were brief. Each consisted of a name, date, time of entry, time of exit, and a one-word note: complete, paused, delayed, or void. No definitions for these terms were given. The first occurrence of the word paused appeared in July 1793. The last use of the word void was logged in February 1799. Only one entry, dated December 29, 1800, bore the word extended. In Salem's religious architecture, baptism was universally understood as symbolic, immediate, and publicly accountable. It was not meant to span hours, and certainly not days. Yet, among the documents submitted by the Coldlakes to the Board of Poor Relief, nothing indicated deviation. In quarterly summaries, all observances were marked regular. However, a single receipt found in a side file dated January 1801 lists an order for 10 lanterns with reinforced glass covers and oil capacity of 48 hours. The order was placed by Aldous Coldlake and filled by a merchant in Marblehead. The invoice specified that the lanterns were for aquatic chamber use. Local knowledge of Willowgate remained limited. Most residents knew the name but had no personal connection. The home did not participate in Salem's annual benevolence fair, nor did it publish sermons in the town circular. Yet among certain congregational circles, the Coldlakes were viewed with admiration for their inward focus and refusal to modernize. A Massachusetts Assembly debate in 1798 briefly cited Willowgate as a proof of enduring early covenant values. A representative from Middlesex even proposed a regional funding boost for similar institutions. The measure was not passed. While the Coldlakes maintained a closed campus, they were legally required to submit to census updates every 10 years. The 1800 enumeration of the property lists 14 full-time residents, including 7 children under age 6. Among these children, 3 were classified as in transition, a term not defined in the census legend. When the census marshal requested clarification, he was referred to Aldous Coldlake, who responded by presenting a sealed statement prepared in advance. The statement, later archived in Salem's clerical annex, reads, "Transition is the state of one not yet named. Their inclusion is procedural, not spiritual." Town correspondence indicates that one local midwife, Mabel Truswick, visited the property briefly in September 1800 to deliver supplies. In a letter to her cousin, dated weeks later, she wrote that the home was tidy but unnervingly silent. She was not invited inside the baptismal wing. Her impression, preserved in the letter, was that the family maintained a schedule tighter than any belle I've served. She made no allegations, and noted that the infants she glimpsed appeared clean and fed. She also mentioned that Ruth Coldlake wore gloves indoors and avoided physical contact. The internal family code was never made public, but fragments were found after the facility was vacated. These fragments included phrases such as "no observance without sealing" and "duration reflects surrender." While such terminology would later be scrutinized, at the time it was seen as austere rather than irregular. The code contained stipulations on fasting, silence, and post-immersion reflection periods, all recorded in passive syntax. None of it contradicted state policy. Throughout this period, the Coldlake family avoided involvement in civil affairs. They declined invitations to appear at Salem's Congregational Synod in 1797 and did not respond to regional surveys on liturgical methodology. Their only public statement came in a single pamphlet, distributed in limited quantity in 1794, titled "On Preparations of the Spirit." It offered no biographical details or institutional overview. The language was abstract, and most copies were discarded. However, the Harvard Divinity Library preserved one example. Inside its cover was a dedication, "To those who do not rush." In archival records from the Salem Parish Office, there exists a single memo dated March 1801 that references a final observance conducted at Willowgate. The document, unsigned and written in unadorned language, indicates that the Coldlake family submitted an updated spiritual accounting that quarter, noting 0 infants pending naming and no planned future entries. This document marked the last official record from the institution. No closure notice was issued. The home was not formally disbanded, nor was its registration revoked. It simply ceased submitting forms. Inspection of adjacent properties in 1802, conducted under a routine land survey mandated by the Essex Land Court, listed Willowgate as uninhabited but structurally intact. A visiting assessor described the grounds as clean, undisturbed, and absent of decay. The surveyor noted with curiosity that all doors were closed, windows sealed, and that a faint layer of chalk had been applied to the thresholds. No entry was attempted. The record classified the property as dormant. By that time, Elias Coldlake was no longer listed among active residents. His name did not appear in town tax ledgers after 1800. Local speculation at the time suggested he had accepted a clerical post in western Connecticut, though no congregation confirmed his presence. Ruth and Marianne were believed to have relocated to Gloucester, according to indirect references in merchant correspondences. Aldous Coldlake, whose name was last signed on a receipt for cleaning salts, left no subsequent trace. Despite these disappearances, no warrants were issued. The absence of complaint or loss prevented legal inquiry. Despite this formal silence, regional clergy had begun to question the Coldlake approach in private correspondences. Letters between divinity tutors and parish overseers in 1801 discuss Willowgate as a site of overextended rites and unsanctioned duration, phrases that appear repeatedly but without definition. One letter, penned by a theological examiner named Whitlock Garvey, speculates that the Coldlakes may have misinterpreted the symbolic nature of immersion. His wording remains cautious, careful not to allege misconduct. Instead, he poses questions: whether duration was ever discussed during inspections, whether the parish understood how long observances were lasting, and whether any child had been observed following such events. The letter contains no accusations. Contemporary religious doctrine made no provision for prolonged immersion. It was understood as a symbolic act, meant to occur quickly and publicly. Yet Garvey's language hints at unease, not because of wrongdoing, but because of something unmeasurable, time spent unseen. If a child was presented for naming on a Sunday morning and not brought forth until the following evening, what mechanisms ensured oversight? Garvey's concern lay in this administrative gap, not in what occurred, but in what could not be accounted for. The observance log, when it was finally retrieved in 1826 during an inventory of closed properties, offered no clarification. It contained only dates, times, and status terms. For the final listed infant, entered on December 29, 1800, the entry reads, "Initiated, 7:42 a.m. Completion January 1st, 7:51 a.m. Status, extended. No footnote, no outcome." At the time of this entry, Massachusetts clerical law still lacked a definition for procedural limits on spiritual rites conducted by private homes. While institutional baptism was expected to mirror church procedure, private facilities were granted interpretive leeway under the category of devotional care. This flexibility was intended to support isolated communities or distant farms where ordained ministers might not be present. The Coldlakes operated under this exemption. Among the few remaining physical elements of the facility, the immersion chamber remains the most precisely documented. A 1791 invoice describes its dimensions as 6 feet deep, 3.5 feet across, with a narrow entry ledge. It was reinforced with stone sourced from local quarries and sealed in layers with a lime compound ordered from Boston. Water entered through a copper intake valve and exited by gravity drain. The chamber included no heating element. Lanterns affixed to the upper walls allowed for light, and a pulley system supported a cloth divider used to shield the chamber from the rest of the suite. This divider bore a stitched symbol, a circle within a triangle, thread matched to the seal found on Willowgate's exterior signage. The symbolism of the triangle motif was not uncommon among late 18th century devotional communities. In the Coldlake context, however, it appeared with unusual frequency. The same symbol was pressed into wax seals on envelopes, burned into wooden trays, and embroidered into garments worn by staff. It was not tied to any known denomination. In one theological analysis commissioned in 1810 by a Boston seminary, the symbol is interpreted as a stylized reference to containment of spirit within ordinance, though this phrase is not found in any Coldlake writing. Public sentiment toward the family, while reserved, did not collapse following their disappearance. With no clear act of misconduct and no public harm, the institution's reputation slowly faded. Willowgate was not publicly condemned or cited. Its story remained confined to archivists and occasional theological discussions. It was only in the late 1840s, when a religious historian catalogued defunct infirmaries, that the Coldlake name resurfaced as part of a broader inquiry into non-standard rites. In that account, the historian notes that no record exists of any infant baptized at Willowgate later joining a parish. None were listed in town rosters, marriage bans, or burial rolls. This lack of civic integration raised questions about whether the children remained in Salem or were transferred elsewhere. The Coldlake family had never provided information on post-observance placements, citing internal realignment as the standard notation for all departures. In a system where even minor adoptions were typically recorded, this omission stood out. By 1850, the building was repurposed as a grain storage facility. The immersion chamber was drained, sealed with brick, and converted into a root cellar. During renovations, workers removed wooden plaques bearing family codes and stored them in a municipal archive. These plaques were later reviewed during a historical preservation effort. Among the inscriptions was a phrase repeated 3 times: "Time without pause becomes readiness." The context of this phrase remains speculative. In the early summer of 1796, a minor administrative irregularity was logged by the Salem Office of Records concerning an unaccounted delivery of medical tinctures to Willowgate. The shipment, which included 32 vials of diluted camphor and 17 sealed jars labeled "for ceremonial suspension," had been recorded under a different category from previous years. Instead of being listed under standard medicinal use, it was filed as ritual preparation. The merchant, based in Newburyport, later testified in a routine ledger review that the labeling had been requested directly by Aldous Coldlake. The merchant was not instructed to clarify its meaning. This detail, while minor, was the first trace of divergence between the public-facing routine of the institution and its internal categorization of materials. No complaint was raised at the time, and the shipment was approved by Salem's distribution board. However, internal correspondence among clerks at the records office later revealed a degree of unease about the phrasing. One clerk, Eliza Morton, noted in her margin annotations, "Terminology shift without prior update to classification schema. This was not pursued further. The ledger was filed." Later that year, in October 1796, a visitor named Eben Lawrence recorded his impressions of Willowgate in a personal travel log. Lawrence, a map surveyor contracted by the Essex Boundary Commission, had been tasked with remeasuring property lines along the South Woods. He noted that the Coldlake grounds appeared excessively ordered to a degree unbefitting natural growth. In his description, hedges were clipped uniformly, stones scrubbed clean, and a layer of coarse gravel had been placed under all outdoor walking paths, despite the rural setting. Lawrence asked to use the lavatory and was escorted to a secondary shed outside the main building, where no fixtures existed, only a basin and folded cloth. He described the experience as ceremonial without preface. While surveyors were not trained in ecclesiastical matters, Lawrence's notes were later referenced by historians for their glimpse into an otherwise undocumented moment. His description of the Coldlake presence as observant but uncommunicative aligned with other indirect accounts. Yet even at that time, no one raised a formal concern. The property remained in compliance with provincial standards. What emerged in 1797, however, began to attract scrutiny not from Salem authorities, but from outside religious observers. A group of traveling doctrinal auditors, led by Reverend Othniel Norridge, visited 5 infirmaries across Essex County as part of a review of baptismal discipline. These reviews were initiated not through any allegation, but due to growing theological interest in how remote institutions applied immersion theology in contrast to urban congregations. Norridge and his team were admitted to Willowgate for precisely 90 minutes. His subsequent notes, which were preserved by the Cambridge Theological Archives, described the visit as punctual and enclosed. The team was guided only through the West Corridor and shown a chart of prayer rotations. They were not allowed to observe any immersion chamber or discuss methods with staff. Ruth Coldlake presented them with a tray of paper scrolls, each containing a handwritten verse from Old Testament scripture. Though no direct commentary was attached, the visitors were thanked and escorted out. In his internal report, Norwich described the home as sealed by routine, noting the absence of spontaneous interaction. He included a final remark that would later be cited repeatedly. There is no question they follow a system, but to whom the system answers remains opaque. This observation was not treated as accusatory, but it did mark a shift in tone. Whereas previous assessments had praised Willowgate's isolation as a sign of discipline, Norwich's phrasing reframed it as self-direction without spiritual accountability. Following his report, 2 other ministers attempted to schedule similar visits. Both were declined with formal letters citing seasonal illness and fasting cycles. No further attempts were made that year. Elsewhere in Salem, the public registry of births, deaths, and transitions showed small inconsistencies related to children originating from Willowgate. Specifically, the number of births attributed to the property did not match the number of transitions recorded. Transitions were defined as moments when a child either received naming or left the institution for placement. In Willowgate's filings, certain children were marked as initiated but never transitioned. These entries remained open, with no subsequent updates. A clerk named Bartholomew Keene flagged this discrepancy in November 1797. His report suggested follow-up with the institution, but no action was taken. At the time, administrative turnover was occurring due to redistricting, and the matter was set aside. Keene's memo was archived, but not followed. During the winter of that same year, the home received a shipment of weather-treated fabric labeled Coverings Extended Use. The delivery log, preserved by the Port of Salem, indicates a bulk order for 30 units of marine-grade cloth with reinforced grommets. The manufacturer, based in Providence, confirmed the order, but stated that it was unusual for inland institutions to require such materials. When asked for clarification, Aldous Coldlake reportedly explained that the coverings were for chamber drapery to prevent lantern fog. The reason was accepted without further question. These patterns of ambiguity continued into 1798. That spring, an orphanage worker from nearby Ipswich named Constance Berridge wrote a letter to her superior after receiving an indirect referral from Willowgate. The referral consisted of a note, unsigned but bearing the Coldlake seal, requesting temporary placement for a male infant who had not yet met the threshold of permanent designation. The child was unnamed and accompanied by a folded note listing dietary conditions and exposure limits. Berridge reported that the child was in good condition, but had not been named nor issued standard travel documents. The orphanage accepted the referral, but Berridge kept the note, puzzled by the terminology. She later remarked that the phrase threshold of permanent designation was unlike anything she had seen in formal church or civil documentation. The language implied a prolonged preparatory state, not recognized in state statutes. Although she raised the issue with her district liaison, no action followed. The Coldlake institution remained in good standing and had not breached any regulation. While these signs accumulated, they remained below the threshold for formal inquiry. No witness alleged mistreatment, no law was broken. Yet the language used, the timing of deliveries, the gaps in placement records, and the tightly controlled appearances all hinted at an internal process not disclosed to any overseeing body. The Coldlakes continued to submit their observance logs, their supply orders, and their quarterly attendance reports without deviation. In April 1798, a schedule variance was noted in the town registrar's log related to Willowgate's customary filing dates. For 9 consecutive quarters, the institution had submitted its records during the first week of the month. That spring, the file arrived 11 days late. While the delay did not violate any regulation, a clerk annotated the page with a single question mark. The entry was otherwise complete, signed by Elias Coldlake, and bore no discrepancy in the number of dependents, rights, or material stock. Yet the irregularity coincided with a set of supply requests from neighboring districts. One nearby church reported that it had been approached by a representative of the Coldlake home requesting spare wicks and beeswax sheets, despite the home having reported an adequate inventory of those items in its previous filing. The representative, described in a minister's side note as a young woman with precise diction, left no name but presented a requisition slip bearing the Coldlake seal. The church provided the materials. A receipt was issued, but no follow-up communication occurred. When the parish later attempted to record the donation in its annual benevolence log, it listed the recipient only as "for Willowgate" via unnamed liaison. This pattern of interaction, official in appearance, ambiguous in execution, grew more frequent in the months that followed. A lantern maker in Rowley noted an increase in orders for long-burn units with sealed chambers and odorless oil. An apothecary in Beverley filed a note that a member of the Coldlake household had ordered a non-standard mixture of clove essence and binding agents, labeled under the purpose "submersive consistency." In both cases, the orders were filled without comment, and no record exists of further correspondence. Within Willowgate itself, the number of residents remained stable according to filings. Yet among the 7 children listed in the spring 1798 ledger, only 3 had transition statuses logged by year's end. The remaining 4 were left under the category active preparation. This terminology, not used by other institutions, appeared consistently in Coldlake documentation from that point forward. Clerks processing the forms filed them without redaction, assuming the phrase indicated a continued catechism schedule. Meanwhile, conversations among clergy began to reference the Coldlake method with a tone of hesitancy. While no wrongdoing had been observed, the semantic structure used by the family began to raise concern. Terms like containment, preparatory extension, and threshold alignment appeared in several circulars circulated within the Eastern Massachusetts Doctrine Guild. These documents, while not public, captured a growing sense that something within the Coldlake practice diverged from provincial custom. Even so, no statute prohibited terminological variation. Without evidence of harm or procedural failure, the matter remained academic. In September 1798, an archivist named Miles Durant requested access to the property for the purpose of cataloguing devotional texts. Durant had received a copy of On Preparations of the Spirit through a used bookseller and had traced its origin to the Coldlake estate. He sent a formal letter asking permission to survey the family's private library and, if allowed, make a copy of their baptismal guides. The response, delivered 5 weeks later, was courteous but firm. It declined the request, citing the protected state of spiritual articulation during internal rotation. Durant, though disappointed, did not press further. His letter remains in the archives, marked "Inquiry Closed." By late 1798, another procedural shift emerged. While previous observance logs listed full names for each child, the fall entries began using only initials. This change was not noted in a cover letter, and no explanation was attached. The Massachusetts Board of Poor Relief, having no policy requiring full names for children prior to transition, accepted the documents without flagging the deviation. Nonetheless, one reviewer, Elnathan Hill, wrote a brief annotation in the margin. Format shifted, legibility retained, but designator specificity reduced. The comment had no regulatory impact. The document was filed. Among remaining institutional notes from that period, one stands out for its lack of context. It is a short correspondence written by Aldous Coldlake to the office of a dye merchant in Boston. The letter requests 5 lengths of ribbon, each specified as uncolored, tightly woven, and fully water-neutral. The merchant's reply, preserved in the same folder, confirms the availability of the items, but adds a handwritten question. Are these intended for outdoor or ceremonial use? There is no reply on record. These fragments, while individually benign, reflect a sustained pattern of procedural opacity. Everything remained within legal bounds, yet little was openly explained. The Coldlakes complied with external requests, submitted all required reports, and maintained formal decorum. What remained hidden was the function behind these choices, why certain items were needed, why certain phrases replaced others, and why the institution's filing language gradually decoupled from common parlance. In December 1798, a member of the Salem Clerical Advisory Council, Thomas Everin, proposed a resolution encouraging all affiliated homes to publish an annual guidebook outlining their rites, spiritual framework, and procedural sequences. The resolution passed in symbolic form but held no enforcement provision. Most institutions complied voluntarily. Willowgate did not. Their reason, recorded in a single sentence, read, "The path of preparation does not yield to sequence for observation." The response was logged and left uncontested. Around the same time, a minor audit was conducted of all privately operated immersion chambers in Essex County. The audit, which checked for water quality, drain function, and structural integrity, included a request for each site to submit the name of their immersion supervisor. Willowgate responded with the title Keeper of the Seal, without attaching a personal name. The board accepted the submission, citing the absence of a naming requirement in existing regulations. The year concluded without incident. The Coldlakes remained in good standing. No inspection failed, no complaint reached the parish or the board. Yet beneath each surface detail, subtle shifts continued. Language, supply type, duration of observances. All of it reflected something internal, unseen and procedurally insulated. The term active preparation, now appearing in every observance report, had become institutional shorthand. And still, the immersion chamber remained sealed from public view. In January 1799, during a period of low administrative activity following the winter holidays, a document was submitted to the Board of Poor Relief from the Willowgate home that deviated subtly from its established format. The quarterly observance log included for the first time a supplementary page titled Deferment Rationale, Third Tier. The page contained no standard language, only a numbered list of initials followed by single-sentence explanations. Phrases included extended due to pre-ascension unclarity, awaiting external calibration, and threshold not confirmed by rotational cycle. None of these terms corresponded with categories used by any other home in the province. No clarification was requested by the board, and the file was accepted into record. This document marked the beginning of a phase in which the internal systems at Willowgate moved into more coded territory. Over the next 2 quarters, the home's reports began using terminology that had not previously appeared in civil or ecclesiastical filings. The changes did not affect their standing. The records remained on time, inventory matched declared use, and no outside intervention was justified. Yet in May of that year, a clerk named Isaac Holcomb, reviewing archive logs for the Regional Compliance Bureau, noted a sustained presence of the word suspension across 5 consecutive immersion entries. His review indicated no breach, but he drafted a private inquiry to be directed to the family's administrative contact, requesting a definition. The reply, penned by Aldous Coldlake, described suspension as a reliance phase between ceremonial intention and interpretive confirmation. The language was abstract but not confrontational. Holcomb filed the correspondence and noted that while non-standard, the usage posed no immediate problem. That summer, a new addition was constructed on the east side of the Willowgate property. Building records show that permits were filed and approved for a storage extension to house ceremonial linens and archival trays. However, correspondence from a supply contractor revealed that the interior included lined alcoves with drainage apertures and recessed iron hooks along the upper walls. When the contractor inquired about the purpose of these additions, he was told by Ruth Coldlake that the space was for positioning during intervals. The phrase, while ambiguous, was not flagged. The construction passed inspection. Meanwhile, a shift in personnel occurred. One of the long-standing family assistants, identified in merchant ledgers as J. Elmer, was no longer seen collecting deliveries or maintaining the outer property. A replacement figure, referred to only as D, began accepting incoming materials. This individual did not sign receipts and maintained no verbal exchange with deliverers. When questioned by a lantern supplier about storage procedures, the response was simply, "This is not my knowledge." No follow-up was made. The presence of an unnamed assistant was not uncommon among such institutions, and the substitution went undocumented in official channels. As late summer approached, the observance log reflected an unusual increase in entries marked interim reset. This status had never appeared in earlier logs. It began in late July and was applied to 3 of the 5 children listed as active. While the category had no clear meaning, each of these entries remained open in subsequent reports. When, in September, a regional auditor inquired about the ongoing nature of these statuses, the Coldlake reply cited extended preparatory circumstances consistent with internal progression markers. The board issued no challenge, as the institution's legal exemption for interpretive rights remained in effect. In October, a merchant from Dedham delivered 2 crates of hand-blown hourglasses to the property, each designed with double-loop filtration to extend sand flow beyond the standard mark. The order was unusual both in quantity and design. When asked whether the items were for ceremonial instruction or domestic scheduling, Aldous Coldlake responded, "They reflect what time cannot compress." The merchant, uncertain whether this was theological or procedural, made no entry of concern. Simultaneously, the naming delay of multiple children extended into its 6th month, surpassing any previously recorded duration under the home's watch. Still, none of the children were listed under withdrawn status. Instead, each retained the designation of rotational preparation. As part of the home's quarterly compliance log, the Coldlake submitted a brief assurance that all observances were being conducted in full accordance with Scripture, though no external observer had been admitted since 1797. This discrepancy was finally noted by a parish assistant named Clara Densley, who drafted a letter requesting visual inspection of the premises under the authority of the Congregational Fellowship Clause. The reply, written by Elias Coldlake, stated that the current immersion cycle could not be disrupted, and that visitation would be accommodated once recalibration had occurred. The clause made no provision for forceful entry, and Densley's inquiry was tabled. Despite these recurring anomalies, the town's civil authorities did not intervene. The Coldlake family remained legally compliant in all filings, and the absence of complaint from any parent, guardian, or external party left no actionable opening. Instead, quiet discussions began among archivists and auditors regarding what was increasingly referred to as prolonged unclarity. Still, nothing was substantiated. In November, a weather specialist from Ipswich assigned to monitor barometric conditions for agricultural forecasting passed by Willowgate during a storm pattern mapping expedition. He noted, in a private journal entry, that several windows of the home's eastern wing remained open during heavy rainfall. When he approached the path, he observed no motion and heard no voices. He described the home as appearing intact yet preserved from interaction. He did not report this observation formally. It remained a personal note among his travel papers. As the year turned, the observance logs shifted again. The final entries of 1799 recorded only 2 active children and introduced the term completion pending extension recognition. With no category to challenge this phrasing, the board accepted the record. The status of previous children listed as in preparation remained unchanged, and no documentation of transition or naming was submitted. It was the longest span recorded in provincial records during which children under a home's care remained undesignated. Then, in December, a brief memorandum was submitted without accompanying observance documents. It was handwritten in brown ink and unsigned, bearing only the Coldlake seal. The message read, "The threshold has approached. Observation is no longer interpretive. Duration is set." The note made no direct reference to any child, rite, or practice. No further explanation was attached. Chapter 3, Part 1 completed. In early January 1800, the quarterly parcel from the Willowgate home arrived at the Salem Registrar's office without the expected enclosures. There were no observance logs, no inventory sheet, and no list of transitions. Instead, the envelope contained a folded cloth square embroidered with a single phrase, "Duration manifests naming." The writing was sewn in charcoal thread and accompanied by a stamped wax seal bearing the institution's emblem. The registrar noted the anomaly and forwarded the parcel to the district clerk. Upon review, it was placed into archive without notation of violation. This absence of standard documentation was considered unusual, but not disqualifying. Under the Board of Poor Relief's guidelines, homes retained latitude for interpretive worship so long as public welfare was not endangered, and reports resumed within one filing cycle. A grace period of 1 quarter was permitted, provided no complaint was lodged. Willowgate, having never missed a previous filing in over a decade, was allowed this leniency. During that same month, a post carrier reported seeing a candle burning in the easternmost window of the Coldlake estate continuously across 3 days. The candle remained lit during daylight hours and was shielded from weather by the window glass. The sighting was recorded in a routine delivery log, but not treated as cause for inquiry. The carrier's entry noted that the property showed no motion, but exhibited signals of vigil. Later that winter, a carpenter based in Topsfield received a request to deliver 3 crates of uncut cedar slats to the Willowgate address. The order contained no specifications for use, only dimensions and a deadline. The carpenter, who had previously filled requests for furniture bases and storage frames, delivered the items on time and was met by the same assistant noted in prior records as D. Payment was rendered in exact coinage. No additional interaction occurred. When asked by an associate about the use of the wood, the carpenter replied that the request had included a handwritten note describing the material as suitable for extended repose. By February, the Coldlake name no longer appeared on the Salem parish attendance rosters. None of the family members had participated in the annual lantern procession or submitted intentions for spring donation drives. This absence was observed by the vestry, but not formally questioned. Several family-led homes had previously opted out of civic rituals while maintaining private observance. As long as institutional records remained current, participation was discretionary. It was not until March 1800 that the registrar's office received the next filing from the Coldlakes. The package contained the usual documents, including the first observance log in over 4 months. The format had changed. Entries now included a numeric column labeled Interval Confirmation with units measured in hours. One entry listed the number 27, another 36, and a third recorded 48. No child names were attached, only initials and their corresponding durations. Each was marked as sealed. In the status column, the word complete had been replaced by the phrase recognized in cycle. This alteration, though unprecedented, was not directly in conflict with any rule. The state had no legislation regulating the timing of immersion beyond a general requirement for health and safety. Since no complaint had been lodged and no injury recorded, the records were accepted. The registrar appended a note suggesting further observation should clarity become a shared goal. The suggestion carried no procedural weight. Around this time, a theological reader named Isidore Twell visited Salem for unrelated doctrinal research and came across several of the Willowgate filings in a shared archive. He wrote a private memorandum describing the documents as dense with personal system, clear in intention, opaque in shared comprehension. He proposed no interpretation, only the idea that the Coldlakes regarded time not as passage, but as articulation. His observations were not distributed, remaining in the seminary's internal library files. In April, 2 separate supply vendors logged deliveries to the Willowgate home within the same week. One involved a shipment of tightly woven linen cords, each pre-cut to identical length and sealed in beeswax. The second was a set of 11 hollow glass spheres with weighted interiors. When questioned by the supplier about the purpose of the objects, Aldous Coldlake reportedly described them as duration anchors. This term, while unusual, was not further explained. By May, the institution listed only 2 children under its active care. Both entries in the observance log showed extended interval durations and were marked as held for threshold. In lieu of standard inventory, the accompanying document detailed changes in material alignment, referencing cloth rotation, water stillness, and interval silence. These terms had not appeared in prior reports. The registrar filed the materials under Interpretive Observance Internal Designation Maintained. Throughout the summer, the property was largely undisturbed. No inspections were scheduled, no new placements were recorded. A single mail courier, assigned to deliver provincial announcements, noted that the path to the main entrance had been raked into concentric rings with no footprints beyond its outer arc. The observation was not entered into official record. Then, in August, a final parcel arrived containing a sealed envelope and a single document titled Duration Finalization, Interval 3. The contents listed initials, matching those of previous entries, alongside a start time of 7:42 a.m. and a closure time 48 hours later. The location was cited as Inner Seal Chamber. Under the outcome column was the phrase, held in prepared state. No further interpretation was offered. No signatures accompanied the file. The registrar marked the document received. It became the last known observance filing from the Coldlake family. In April 1801, the Coldlake property was formally classified as dormant. The designation issued by the Salem land clerk reflected no evidence of abandonment or misuse. Instead, it indicated that the estate was structurally sound, its filings had ceased without violation, and no occupants had responded to routine correspondence in over 3 months. The term was used for properties that showed signs of intentional vacancy without decay. It allowed the town to reassign certain maintenance responsibilities while preserving the estate's legal ownership in absentia. On May 2nd, a notary assigned to update property boundary charts approached the grounds and recorded that all shutters were sealed, doors latched from the inside, and the gravel paths remained undisturbed. He found no broken locks, no fallen debris, and no sign of forced entry. In his summary, he noted the impression of a maintained stillness. He left without attempting to enter. There was no mandate to compel access. Weeks later, during a seasonal audit of spiritual registries, an archivist named Lavinia Shawcross discovered a set of delayed correspondences in a transition annex. Among these was a letter, postmarked 3 months prior, addressed to the Board of Poor Relief and bearing the Coldlake seal. The envelope was unbroken. When opened, the contents revealed a final statement from the institution, dated January 31st, 1801. The message consisted of 8 words. All intervals recognized. Extension completed. No successors named. The letter bore no signature, but the script matched prior filings. Shawcross logged the document and filed it in a closure index. Following that entry, no further communication emerged from the Coldlake estate. In July, the estate's registry was updated to reflect 0 dependents, no pending rights, and no anticipated reactivation. By protocol, the property remained listed under its last known custodial title, with no expiration unless challenged through claim or foreclosure. No such challenge was submitted. The local parish, in reviewing its annual liturgical census, noted the absence of any named individuals originating from Willowgate in public parish records. No christenings had occurred under its entries. No marriage bans or confirmations listed Willowgate as a place of origin. Over a span of 13 years, no documented parishioner emerged from the institution. The gap was unusual, but not disallowed. Under the structure of private religious care, homes could maintain closed rights without public participation if guardianship was self-sustained. Still, a note was placed in the annual report citing Willowgate as non-contributory to communal observance. Over time, the Coldlake name began to recede from town conversation. The property stood, but without activity. Children passing by the old cedar fence were told by older siblings that the place was for quiet prayers, though none of them had ever seen anyone enter or leave. By 1805, the building was referred to in estate maps only by its geographic coordinates. The name Willowgate no longer appeared in civil charts. In 1813, during a regional reclassification of land for agricultural zoning, the estate was visited by a deputy of the Essex Allocation Board. His report described the grounds as intact but dormant. The garden rows were still aligned, though overgrown. Interior windows showed drawn cloth, and the immersion chamber annex remained locked from within. He submitted a zoning update request, but received no counterclaim. With no one asserting residency, the estate was marked for conditional agricultural use. The building itself remained untouched. By 1821, the Coldlake family had left no traceable records elsewhere in Massachusetts. No legal heirs, court filings, or property transfers were attributed to any member. Inquiries submitted to surrounding counties returned no result. A researcher from the Theological Consortium in Plymouth submitted a letter to the State Library requesting clarification on the estate's closure, but the reply stated only that the facility had ceased operations in accordance with all applicable requirements. No investigation had been opened. The case was marked concluded. That same year, a teacher from the North Salem district brought a class of pupils near the outer edge of the Coldlake property for a nature survey. During the outing, one student pointed out that the door to the immersion annex remained unweathered, despite its exposure. The teacher described the moment in her journal, noting the unusual preservation of the exterior wood. She remarked that the door's handle bore no rust, and that the hinges appeared recently oiled. No further examination occurred. In 1826, the Town Council of Salem passed a motion to inventory all inactive religious facilities for archival review. Willowgate was included in the list. A small team was dispatched to open the property under clerical supervision. Entry was made through the main corridor using an archivally approved bypass key, constructed based on structural diagrams from the original registry. Inside, the rooms were arranged as described in historical filings. The west corridor remained furnished with devotional trays, saltwater vessels, and framed segments of code excerpts. The east chamber was closed, with its door marked by a plaque reading, "Held in Seal." When opened, the chamber revealed a dry interior, lined in preserved slate with 3 lantern hooks suspended from the overhead beam. The immersion basin was drained. No watermarks indicated recent use. A series of cedar slats, identical in size, had been stacked near the chamber's edge. None were affixed to the structure. On the adjacent wall, 3 small hourglasses rested in a recessed alcove. All had expired. The inspection team recorded no anomalies and found no human presence. Archival materials were collected and boxed. Among them was the observance ledger, last updated in 1801. It was catalogued and transferred to the Essex Clerical Repository. The chamber was resealed, and the estate was marked as eligible for preservation under dormant classification. No further attempts were made to reopen or repurpose the Coldlake property during the remainder of the century. In 1834, a committee of historical preservation clerks conducted a survey of former devotional properties with the intent of compiling a regional ledger of discontinued institutions. The Willowgate estate was included due to its uninterrupted structural retention and lack of successor activity. A team of 2 clerks and a mapping assistant visited the site under municipal directive, equipped with instruments for measuring foundational stability and documenting any recoverable records. Upon entry, the building's condition remained sound. Dust had accumulated on exterior frames, but no signs of animal intrusion or vandalism were found. The corridors retained their orientation, and the inner walls displayed inscriptions matching descriptions from prior inventories. The western wing contained framed phrases including, "Seal the naming before the pause," "Repose occurs within unbroken sequence," and "External witness is not a threshold." The team discovered a secondary ledger beneath a floor panel in what had once been the administrative chamber. The ledger, preserved in waxed cloth, contained no dates, only symbols and interval notations. Most symbols resembled repeated geometric figures, concentric rings, nested triangles, and 3-part vertical lines. These were followed by columns marked with numerical values ranging from 20 to 50, all without attached labels. The ledger was reviewed, photographed, and returned to the Salem Archival Annex. One entry in the final pages of the book contained a handwritten phrase that differed from the rest. It read, "Duration is not held in time, but in return." No authorship was indicated. The language was consistent with earlier phrases attributed to Coldlake filings. This page, while noted, was not interpreted. The document was placed in storage under non-exhibit designation owing to the absence of names, dates, or direct historical references. By the late 1830s, discussion of Willowgate was confined to academic circles. No reactivation proposal was filed. The property remained listed as dormant. A small number of theological examiners referenced the Coldlake system in lectures concerning private devotional interpretation, usually as a case study in sustained internal practice. Most regarded the institution as an example of sanctioned isolation within lawful bounds. A minority argued that its legacy reflected the absence of procedural transparency, but no inquiries were reopened. In 1842, a cartographic update of eastern Massachusetts listed the property under a new map code. R-172D, defined as religious structure, sealed. This classification was applied to fewer than 5 locations statewide. The code included a note stating, "No public access required, review complete." The entry was last updated in 1847. As years progressed, structural assessments noted that the immersion annex remained sealed from inside. The lock, made of aged brass and fitted with a coil hinge, had not corroded. Restoration teams sent for occasional surveys found no justification for forced access, as the chamber posed no safety risk and had not been requisitioned for alternate use. In 1858, a visiting architect from Philadelphia requested access to the site for a planned study of symmetrical layouts in private religious facilities. His request was denied. The Salem Preservation Office cited the original closure status and emphasized that no heirs or stakeholders had come forward. A formal statement noted that the property remains aligned with its final configuration and shall not be disassembled. No exceptions were recorded. A decade later, in 1869, a theological symposium in Concord included a brief paper titled "Structures Without Continuance: The Role of Devotional Inactivity." One section referenced the Coldlake system, referring to it as an intact example of completion without expansion. The author refrained from conjecture, instead stating, "Its record ends without fracture. What began internally concluded internally." The paper was well received and cited in subsequent liturgical ethics discussions. The structure of the home, particularly the immersion chamber's configuration, remained of occasional interest to researchers. By the 1870s, several academic institutions had submitted inquiries regarding access to study the interior design. Each request was denied. Salem's council maintained that the home's final filing designated the space as closed and that its contents were not subject to external preservation mandates. Among the last documented references to Willowgate came in 1883, when a regional clerical historian compiled an index of dormant properties for the state's religious record. Willowgate appeared with a short note. All operations concluded in January 1801, no successors named. All rights closed. No additional detail was offered. By 1895, the structure had been added to the list of non-intervention sites held by the Salem Historical Registry. This designation required that the estate be monitored, but not altered, entered, or subjected to renovation unless an emergent legal cause presented itself. No such cause arose. The Coldlake name did not reappear in any official record before the turn of the century. In reviewing the final estate file, inspectors recorded that all doors had remained closed for over 90 years, all lantern hooks remained in position, and no threshold had been crossed. The immersion basin, once central to the estate's observance, remained sealed, dry, and unentered. No names transitioned, no rites resumed. The duration ended without return. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way, we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering. This story was taken from documents that were found. All names have been edited to protect the source.